Rancher bought a Chinese woman for $20, but what she asked next broke the lone rancher's heart for as long as anyone could remember. The rancher lived alone. His name was Jonah, a tall, broad-shouldered man with weathered hands that told the story of a life spent working the land. His ranch, a large plot of land that stretched for miles, was his world. There were no neighbors nearby, no family to visit, and very few people passing through. His days were long, filled with the daily chores of tending to the animals, mending fences, and maintaining the old farmhouse that had been in his family for generations. Jonah didn't mind the solitude at first. When he was young, he had relished the peace of being alone with his thoughts. But as the years passed, the silence began to weigh on him. He could still remember the days when his parents had lived here with him, when the farmhouse had been filled with the sound of laughter and the warmth of a family. Now it was just him and the cows, the horses, and the endless stretches of land. His neighbors, who lived miles away, were too far for regular visits, and the few friends he had made over the years were busy with their own lives. Jonah had always been a man of few words, and that made it harder to strike up friendships with others. Most of the time he was content with the rhythm of his daily work. But at night, when the sun set and the wind whispered through the trees, he felt the loneliness creep in. In the quiet moments after dinner, sitting by the dim light of an oil lamp, Jonah found himself staring out of the window, his mind wandering to what might be. He had never been married. There had been women in his life, but somehow nothing had ever worked out. Maybe it was his nature, maybe it was the land, or maybe he just hadn't found the right person. Whatever the reason, he remained a bachelor, and with each passing year the idea of spending his life alone seemed to settle more and more deeply in his heart. But as time went on, Jonah started to feel the emptiness more acutely. He had no one to share the victories with, no one to help him carry the burdens. When the weather turned bad, or when the crops didn't grow as they should, he had no one to turn to for comfort or help. The loneliness gnawed at him, especially in the evenings when the house seemed to echo with the absence of another soul. One evening, as he sat alone at his worn wooden table, he heard a story that would change everything. A traveling salesman had passed through the nearby town, and as Jonah sat in the general store sipping his coffee, the man began to speak of something Jonah had never heard of before: mail-order brides. The salesman described how women from distant lands, like China and the Philippines, were willing to marry men in America for a better life. These women, often living in poor conditions, would agree to marry a man who could provide for them in exchange for a ticket to a new life. The idea seemed strange at first. Jonah couldn't quite believe it. The thought of a woman, someone he didn't even know, agreeing to marry him for something as simple as a ticket to a better life sounded like something out of a faraway tale. But as the salesman spoke more, Jonah's curiosity began to grow. These women, the salesman explained, were chosen carefully, matched with men who could offer them a future. It wasn't a love story, but it could be a chance for both parties to start fresh. The idea stayed with Jonah long after the salesman had left town. He couldn't shake it from his mind. He had always wanted a family, always imagined having someone to share his life with. The thought of bringing someone to his ranch, someone who could help with the work and maybe even care for him as he grew older, felt like a dream he could finally reach. And so, after much contemplation, Jonah decided to take the leap. With hesitation in his heart, he found a service that arranged these marriages. The process seemed simple enough. For $20, the service would find a woman who was interested in marrying a man from America. The sum wasn't much, but it was all Jonah could afford at the time. He sent the money, filled out the forms, and waited, not knowing exactly what to expect. Months passed before Jonah heard anything back. At first, he wondered if it had all been a scam, but then a letter arrived. In the letter was a picture of a young woman, her face framed by long black hair. Her name was Li Mei, and she was from China. The letter was brief but warm, expressing her gratitude for the opportunity to meet Jonah and her excitement about starting a new life. It was clear that she was as nervous about this arrangement as he was. Jonah stared at her picture for a long time. She looked so far away from the life he had imagined, yet there was something about her calm eyes that made him think this could work. He wasn't expecting love, but maybe, just maybe, This could be the start of something good. When the day finally arrived, Jonah's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard that Lee May would be arriving by train at the small station near his ranch. He didn't know what to expect. He had imagined this moment in his head 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, it felt surreal. He drove his old truck to the station, trying to calm his nerves. As he waited, Jonah couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. What if she didn't like him? What if she didn't want to stay? What if she hated the ranch, hated the life he could offer? The train arrived, and as passengers disembarked, Jonah saw her. Lee May stood at the edge of the platform, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was small, dressed in a simple coat, and looked as nervous as he felt. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them knew what to say. Jonah took a step forward, his heart racing, and greeted her in broken English.
"Lee May?" he asked. She smiled shyly and nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground.
Jonah felt a lump form in his throat. "Welcome to my ranch," he said, his voice rough. "I hope you'll like it here." Lee May hesitated for a moment, then looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "I hope to make you proud." Jonah smiled, though it felt stiff on his face. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he was ready to find out. As they drove back to the ranch, Jonah couldn't help but glance at Lee May. She was sitting silently beside him, looking out the window, clearly lost in thought. He wondered what was going through her mind. She had come so far to start a new life with a man she had never met. Jonah didn't know if he was capable of giving her the life she expected, but he was determined to try. He just hoped that somehow along the way, they could build something real together. That night, as they sat down to dinner, Jonah tried to make her feel comfortable. He didn't know how to communicate with her at first, but he tried. He didn't have much to offer, just simple food and the warmth of his home, but he wanted to make her feel welcome. Lee May, for her part, was polite but distant. She seemed unsure of herself, hesitant to speak as if every word was being measured. She picked at her food, her mind clearly elsewhere, and Jonah could tell she was homesick. He didn't know how to comfort her. He didn't even know where to begin. But in the silence between them, Jonah realized something important. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his loneliness or his need for a companion. This was about Lee May's journey, too. She was here for a reason, just as he had brought her here for a reason. And whatever came next, they would both have to find their way through it together. The days after Lee May's arrival were full of awkward silences and nervous exchanges. Jonah had never been good with people, let alone someone he barely knew, and it was clear that Lee May was just as uneasy. At first, Jonah didn't know what to say to her. He tried to make small talk, asking about her journey, but the words didn't come easily. Lee May, on the other hand, smiled politely, but didn't say much. Her eyes often wandered, and Jonah could see she was thinking about something else, something far away. They shared the same space but didn't quite know how to fill the silence. Jonah noticed how she clutched her small suitcase tightly when she arrived at the house, as if it held everything she had left. The house, with its creaky floors and sparse furniture, felt cold and unfamiliar to both of them. She had left behind everything she knew, her family, her home, and here she was, in a strange place with a man she barely knew, trying to make a life for herself. Jonah, who had spent most of his life alone, found it hard to connect with her. But despite the silence, he couldn't help but notice the way Lee May's eyes looked at everything with wonder, as if everything in her new world was unfamiliar. She stared at the open fields outside the window, the wind rustling the tall grass. The land seemed endless, and Jonah wondered if she felt small in this vast, quiet place. He knew he did sometimes. Each day followed a similar pattern. Jonah would wake early, taking care of the animals, checking the fences, and doing whatever needed to be done around the ranch. Lee May would watch from the window, sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Sometimes she would help with small chores, like washing dishes or sweeping the floor. She didn't speak much, but Jonah didn't mind. He wasn't one for conversation either. Still, there was something about her, something that made Jonah feel like he should try harder. Her silence wasn't hostile or distant, but filled with a kind of sadness, a longing that he couldn't quite understand. Jonah couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here, why she had agreed to come to this strange land, to a man she had never met. One afternoon, as Jonah was working on the barn, he saw Lee May standing near the porch. She was looking out across the land, her gaze distant, and Jonah felt a twinge of sadness in his chest. It wasn't just that she was in a foreign land, it was that she was alone. The weight of her situation seemed to hang around her, and Jonah could sense it. She wasn't just looking at the land, she was looking for something, perhaps for answers that could only be found back home. Jonah took a deep breath and decided to approach her. He wasn't sure how to start the conversation, but he knew he had to try. He had invited her here, after all. She hadn't come on her own.
"Lee May," he said, his voice tentative. "Are you feeling all right?"
She turned to him, her eyes wide, and gave a small, unsure smile. "Yes, Jonah," she said softly. "I am fine." But Jonah could see that she wasn't fine. Her voice was too quiet, her shoulders too stiff. There was something heavy in the air, something unsaid. Jonah shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure of how to break through the silence that surrounded them. "You can tell me if there's anything you need," Jonah offered, his voice softer than he intended. Lee May didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, as if searching for the right words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she looked up at him. "I miss my family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I miss them very much."
Jonah felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had heard her speak of her family before in letters. How she had left them behind in China. How they had struggled for years. But hearing it from her, in her own voice, made the reality sink in. This wasn't just a woman looking for a husband. She was a daughter, a sister, a person with a life she had left behind. "I'm sorry," Jonah said, his voice thick. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you had to be here. I wanted to help." Lee May shook her head. "It is not your fault," she said, but Jonah could see the sadness in her eyes. "I chose this." Jonah didn't know what to say to that. She hadn't chosen him, not in the way one might choose a partner for love or companionship. She had chosen this life because it offered something better, something that promised a chance to lift her family out of poverty. Jonah didn't know what to do with that kind of weight. He had wanted a partner, someone to share his life with, but Lee May had come to him out of desperation. Over the next few days, the silence between them grew heavier. Jonah tried his best to continue with his work, but his thoughts often drifted to Lee May and her sadness. He couldn't help but feel that he had failed her in some way. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because she had no other choice, and every time he saw her, her quiet demeanor reminded him of that fact. But Jonah also saw something else in her. Despite her sadness, she had a quiet strength. She didn't complain, didn't beg for anything. She helped where she could, washing dishes, folding the laundry, tending to the small garden by the house. It was clear that she was doing her best to adjust, but she was still so far from home. One evening, after dinner, Jonah sat by the fire, a cup of coffee in his hands. Lee May was sitting across from him, her gaze fixed on the flames. The silence stretched between them, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It was a kind of shared understanding, a mutual recognition that they were both in this together, though neither of them knew exactly what this was. Jonah set his cup down and looked at her. "You know, Lee May," he began, his voice careful, "if you ever want to go back home, I can help you. I understand if this place is too much." Lee May looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Believe. Jonah felt his heart beat a little faster, unsure of how she would respond. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "I came here to help my family. I made a promise, and I will keep that promise." Jonah nodded, though a part of him wished it could be different. He didn't want her to feel trapped, didn't want her to feel like she had to stay out of some obligation. He wanted her to be happy, to have the life she deserved. But that wasn't something he could give her, not with just a ranch and an empty house.
"I respect that," Jonah said,
his voice rough with emotion.
I just want you to know you're not alone here. I'll do what I can. Li Mei smiled softly, the first real smile Jonah had seen from her. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to make his heart swell with a quiet hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something neither of them could fully understand yet. Over time, as the days stretched into weeks, Jonah began to learn more about Li Mei's quiet determination. He saw her work tirelessly, tending to the house, helping with the animals, and slowly, they began to form a routine. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper. It was respect. It was understanding. It was two people learning to live with one another, despite their differences, despite the weight of their circumstances. And although the silence remained, it wasn't always filled with sadness. Sometimes it was just the comfort of two people sharing a space, even if they didn't yet know how to bridge the gap between them. Jonah wasn't sure where this would go, but he was starting to understand something important. Maybe the path to something better wasn't about finding love. Maybe it was about finding a way to coexist, to give each other what they needed, even if it wasn't what they had originally hoped for. Jonah's days had settled into a kind of routine. The farm, as always, demanded his attention, and Li Mei had begun to take on more tasks around the house. They worked in silence, but it was no longer the uncomfortable silence that had first hung between them. It was more like the quiet of two people who were learning to share the same space without the need for constant words. Still, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something between them was left unsaid. Li Mei never complained. She did everything he asked of her, without question, without protest. She woke up early to help him with the animals, tended to the small garden by the house, and kept the house clean. There was a quiet dignity in her actions, a grace that Jonah admired. But as the days passed, it became clear to him that she wasn't entirely happy. It wasn't hard to see. Jonah wasn't blind. Her eyes would often wander as she worked, looking at the horizon as if searching for something she couldn't find here. She had told him she missed her family, but there was more to it than that. There were moments when she looked so distant, so lost, and Jonah couldn't help but wonder what was really going on inside her mind. One evening after a long day's work, Jonah sat on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his face. Li Mei came outside, holding a small bowl of tea in her hands, and handed it to him. He thanked her and took a sip, savoring the warmth. They sat together in the quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Jonah glanced at her, trying to figure out what she was thinking. He wanted to ask her how she was truly feeling, but every time he opened his mouth, the words got stuck. He didn't know if she'd even want to share her feelings with him. After a long silence, Jonah finally spoke. "Li Mei," he said, his voice hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about missing your family. I know you didn't come here by choice, and I want you to know that I didn't bring you here to make you feel trapped. If you want to go back, I can help. I'll get you the money, anything you need." Li Mei's head snapped up at his words. Her eyes widened, and for a moment Jonah saw a flash of something. Fear? Hope? He couldn't tell. She shook her head quickly. "No, Jonah," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't go back. My family needs me. I promised them I would help." Jonah's heart tightened at her words. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't that. He had hoped she might be happy, that she might want to stay. But her determination, her sense of responsibility was so strong that it made him feel small in comparison. He had wanted to offer her freedom, but she didn't want freedom. She wanted to keep her promise no matter what. "I didn't come here for you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came for them."
I had to come. My family.
They're poor. They don't have much, and this is the only way I can help them. I had no choice. But now that I am here, I don't know what to do. Jonah didn't know what to say. He had thought this was a simple arrangement, that they would find something between them. But Li Mei's story was more complicated than he had realized. She had come here because she felt it was the only way to help her family. She had made a sacrifice, one that Jonah couldn't fully understand, and now She was caught in a world she didn't know, with a man she hadn't chosen, trying to fulfill a promise that weighed heavy on her heart. Jonah sat in silence, feeling a deep sadness creep into his bones. He had wanted to help her, wanted to offer her a life that was better than what she had left behind. But now he understood that her sense of duty to her family was stronger than anything he could offer. She wasn't here for him. She was here to escape her own circumstances, and that made her heart ache in a way he couldn't fix. Over the next few days, Jonah noticed that Lee May's mood became more withdrawn. She would still help with the daily chores, but her actions seemed mechanical, as if she was going through the motions without really being present. Her smile, when it came, was small and fleeting. Jonah had hoped that, in time, she would adjust, that they would both find a way to be comfortable together. But it was clear now that she was carrying a weight far heavier than any of the work they did on the ranch. One afternoon, as Jonah finished mending a fence near the back of the property, he saw Lee May standing at the edge of the field looking out over the land. She stood still, her shoulders hunched, her hands wrapped tightly around the hem of her coat. She seemed so small in that vast space, like a person who didn't belong, caught between two worlds she couldn't reconcile. Jonah set down his tools and walked toward her. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he couldn't just leave her standing there, lost in her thoughts. As he approached, Lee May turned to him, and for the first time in a while her expression was soft. "Are you okay?" Jonah asked, his voice gentle. Lee May nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a sadness in them that Jonah couldn't ignore. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to be distant. I don't want to make you feel like I'm not trying." Jonah shook his head. "No, you don't have to apologize. I just want to understand. I want to help." Lee May looked away, her gaze drifting back towards the horizon. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "I'm not sure if I can stay here, Jonah. I've tried to adjust, but I miss my family so much. I don't know if this is the right thing anymore. I don't know if this is what I was meant to do." Jonah felt a deep ache in his chest. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that she could stay and find happiness here. But he knew that wasn't the truth. She wasn't here for herself. She was here to fulfill a duty to her family. Jonah had tried to offer her a life, but it wasn't the life she had imagined. She had come here for survival, for a promise, not for love or a fresh start. "I understand," Jonah said quietly. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to be here. You deserve a choice, not an obligation." Lee May smiled faintly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think you would understand." Jonah placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a small, reassuring squeeze. "I don't know if I can help you the way you want, but I'll always listen. If you want to go home, I'll make sure you can. If you want to stay, you're not alone here." For the first time in a long while, Leonisa's shoulders relaxed, and she looked at Jonah with something that resembled relief. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "Thank you, Jonah. I don't know what to do yet, but I'll think about it." Jonah didn't push her. He knew that no matter what decision she made, it had to be hers. But deep down, he felt that something was changing. They weren't just two strangers anymore. They were two people caught in the same struggle, both trying to find a way through a difficult, uncertain situation. As the days passed, Jonah continued to care for his land and animals, but now, more than ever, he felt the weight of Lee May's burden. She wasn't just a stranger in his home. She was a person with hopes, dreams, and sacrifices of her own. And somehow, despite the distance between them, Jonah felt a growing respect for her quiet strength. He could see the fire in her eyes when she spoke about her family, and it made him admire her even more. But Jonah also knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, they both had decisions to make. The future wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. They couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Both of them had to confront their own truths and figure out what came next. The days that followed were a quiet struggle. Lee May and Jonah fell into an uneasy rhythm, both of them knowing that something wasn't quite right between them, yet neither fully understanding what that something was. The ranch was still a place of hard work, filled with the constant demands of daily chores, but the weight of unspoken feelings seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Jonah couldn't help but notice the small, subtle changes in Lee May. She no longer sat by the window, watching the fields with longing. Instead, she spent most of her time tending to the animals or cleaning the house. It wasn't that she complained, she never did, but Jonah could see the sadness in her eyes. It was a sadness that hadn't been there before. It was deeper, more profound, and it troubled him more than anything. The rancher had always been a man of action. When something needed fixing, he fixed it. But this situation, with Lee May, was something he couldn't fix with hard work or simple gestures. He had tried to give her space, tried to respect her wishes, but it was clear now that the silence between them wasn't going to heal itself. He had been giving her room to settle in, but deep down he knew he couldn't ignore her sadness forever. One evening, after a long day of working the fields, Jonah sat down by the fire, his hands aching from the labor. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling into his bones. Lee May was sitting across from him, her posture stiff, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, and Jonah could no longer ignore the tension. He had to know what was really going on inside her heart. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice careful. "Lee May, I can see that something's not right. You don't have to tell me everything, but if there's something you're carrying, you can share it with me. We've been living like this for weeks, and I know you're not happy." Lee May's head snapped up, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected him to say anything. For a moment she looked as though she might say something, but instead she lowered her gaze to the floor, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Jonah waited patiently, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel that the moment had come, the moment when the truth would finally be spoken, when everything between them would be laid bare. I didn't think it would be like this," Lee May said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I thought maybe I could do this, that maybe things would get better. But every day feels harder." "I miss my family so much, Jonah. I feel like I'm losing myself here." Jonah's heart sank as he listened to her words. He had known she was struggling, but hearing it from her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, struck him harder than he had expected. Lee May wasn't just homesick. She wasn't just adjusting to a new life. She was breaking, bit by bit, under the weight of her promises and the expectations she had placed on herself. "I didn't know how much I would miss them," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought coming here would be a way to help them, to make their lives better. But now I don't know if it was the right choice. I don't know if this is the life I was supposed to have." Jonah sat still, feeling the deep sadness in her words. She had come here, not for herself, but for her family. Her journey wasn't about finding love or happiness. It was about sacrifice. She had left everything she knew behind, not for the promise of a better life for her, but for the hope that her family might have a brighter future. And now, sitting here on his ranch, in a world so far removed from everything she had ever known, she was beginning to see the toll that sacrifice had taken on her. "I'm so sorry, Lee May," Jonah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted you to feel like this. I thought maybe we could build something together. But I see now that you didn't come here for me." "You came here because you had no other choice." Lee May nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never wanted to disappoint you. I didn't know what to expect when I came here. I thought maybe things would be different. But I feel like I'm losing everything. I miss my family so much, Jonah. I miss my home. I miss the life I had before." Jonah swallowed hard, his heart breaking for her. He had tried to offer her a new beginning, a chance to start fresh. But it wasn't his life she was longing for. It was the life she had left behind, the family she had left behind. And no matter how much he wanted to be the man who could give her everything she needed, he couldn't replace what she had lost.
"I understand," Jonah said softly.
"I see now that I've been trying to fix something that can't be fixed. You didn't come here to be with me. You came here for your family, and I can't make that go away. I don't want you to feel like you have to stay here if it's not what you need. You don't have to carry this weight alone." Li Mei looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "But what about you, Jonah? What will happen to you if I leave?" Jonah gave a small, sad smile. "I'll be fine. I've spent most of my life alone. I'm used to it. But you deserve to have the life you want. If that means going home, if that means being with your family again, then I'll help you get there. You shouldn't have to stay here for me." Li Mei was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the fire. Jonah could see the inner turmoil on her face, the conflict between her sense of duty and her desire for freedom. She had promised her family she would make their lives better, and yet here she was, torn between that promise and the life she had built on the ranch. Finally, Li Mei spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Jonah. I don't know if I can leave. But I don't know if I can stay either. I feel so lost." Jonah stood up and walked over to her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was a moment of change, a turning point for both of them. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to decide right now," Jonah said softly. "Take your time. I'll support whatever choice you make. Just know that you don't have to carry this burden alone." Li Mei looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. It was a smile filled with gratitude, with a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Jonah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll think about it. I'll figure it out." Jonah gave her a reassuring nod, then turned to walk away, leaving her to her thoughts. He knew that this wasn't the end of their story. Not yet. But whatever happened next, he was determined to let Li Mei make her own choice. He couldn't force her to stay, and he couldn't make her go. But he could offer her the freedom to choose. As the days passed, Jonah and Li Mei remained distant, each lost in their own thoughts. The ranch, once filled with the quiet of hard work, was now filled with the weight of difficult decisions. Jonah didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that for both of them, the journey ahead would require more than just hard work. It would require understanding, patience, and above all, the courage to face the truth. The days that followed felt like a slow drift toward a decision that neither Jonah nor Li Mei was ready to make. The quiet of the ranch had become even more pronounced, the space between them growing wider with every passing hour. It wasn't the work that weighed on them, but the heavy thoughts that filled the silence, the unspoken truth that neither of them could escape. Jonah tried to maintain the same routine, focusing on the farm, but the feeling of impending change lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. Li Mei had become more withdrawn in the past few days, spending hours outside, staring at the horizon or sitting quietly by the fire, her mind clearly far from the ranch. It was as if the land itself had become a reminder of everything she had left behind. Jonah knew the time had come for her to make a choice. He had told her time and again that she didn't have to stay if it wasn't what she wanted. But deep down, he understood her struggle. She wasn't just facing the decision to stay or leave. She was grappling with the weight of a promise she had made to her family, a promise that had brought her here and had kept her going despite the pain of separation. One afternoon, Jonah found Li Mei sitting on the porch, her face buried in her hands. The sight of her like that sent a sharp pang through his chest. He had known she was struggling, but seeing her in such a vulnerable state made him feel helpless. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, but knowing that he couldn't leave her like this.
"Li Mei,"
he called softly. She looked up, her eyes red from the tears she had been holding back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words, with everything they hadn't said to each other. Jonah sat down beside her, giving her space, but offering his presence, a silent assurance that she wasn't alone. "I don't know what to do," Li Mei said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I miss my family so much, Jonah. I miss them more than I can say. But I also feel like I'm betraying them. I promised I would make their lives better. I thought coming here would help, but now I'm not sure if it's the right choice." Jonah's heart ached at her words. He could hear the pain in her voice, the confusion that clouded her thoughts. She wasn't just torn between staying or leaving. She was torn between her duty to her family and her own happiness, between the promise she had made and the reality of the life she had found on the ranch.
"You didn't betray anyone," Jonah said gently.
You've done everything you can. I see how hard you've worked, how much you've sacrificed. But you're allowed to think about your own happiness, too. You don't have to carry all of this alone, Lee May. She shook her head, as if trying to push away the comfort he offered. But what about you? What happens to you if I leave? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah took a deep breath. The question caught him off guard, but it was a fair one. He had tried to be strong for her, but he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. His life, too, had changed since she came to the ranch. He had come to care for her, to see her not as someone he had brought here out of loneliness, but as a person with her own hopes and dreams.
"It's not about me, Lee May," Jonah said, his voice steady but filled with emotion.
I've spent most of my life alone and I'll be okay. But you deserve more than this, more than feeling stuck between two worlds. You deserve a chance to live the life you want, not just the life that's been chosen for you. Lee May looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to understand the depth of his words. She didn't speak for a long time, but Jonah could see the battle taking place inside her. She had never asked for much, never expected anything more than what she could give. But now, standing at the crossroads of her life, she was forced to confront the truth of what she really wanted. I don't know if I'm strong enough to make this decision, Lee May confessed, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I can leave my family, if I can abandon the promise I made. But I don't know if I can stay here either, not when my heart is so far away. Jonah placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. You don't have to make that decision right now, he said softly. Take your time, there's no rush. But whatever you choose, just know that I will always respect it. I just want you to be at peace with whatever path you take. Lee May nodded, tears silently falling down her cheeks. The decision was hers to make, but the weight of it was unbearable. Jonah could see that she was torn between two impossible choices, and that nothing he said could ease her pain. She wasn't just struggling with the idea of leaving. She was struggling with the idea of abandoning the very people who had shaped her life. The next morning, Jonah woke to the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside, a reminder of the change that was in the air. Lee May was still asleep in the small room she had made for herself in the house. Jonah glanced at her as he prepared his breakfast, noticing how peaceful she looked in her sleep. It was strange to see her so calm, knowing that the storm in her heart was still raging. He didn't want to pressure her, but Jonah knew that it was time for the decision to be made. He had offered her the freedom to choose, to find her own path, but the longer she stayed here, the harder it would be for both of them. The ranch was not just a place for work. It was a place where dreams could either grow or wither, and he wanted her to have a chance at something better than just survival. Later that morning, Lee May came to him as he was working in the barn. She was holding a small bag, her face a mixture of resolve and sadness. Jonah stopped what he was doing and turned to her, sensing that the moment had come. I've made my decision, Lee May said, her voice steady despite the emotions that were clearly overwhelming her. I have to go home, Jonah. I can't stay here anymore. My family needs me, and I need to be with them. Jonah nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. He knew this was the choice she had to make, but it didn't make it any easier. I understand, Lee May. I'll help you get there. Whatever you need, I'll make sure you're safe.
Lee May looked at him with gratitude in her eyes.
Thank you, she whispered. You've been so kind to me, Jonah. I will never forget what you've done. Jonah smiled, though it was a sad smile, filled with the knowledge that this was the right choice for her, even if it meant their time together had come to an end. You'll always have a place here, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I hope you find what you're looking for, Lee May.
And I hope you find peace. Lee May took a deep breath, then turned to leave.
She walked slowly, her steps heavy, as if each one was a farewell to a life she would never fully embrace. Jonah watched her go, feeling the sting of loss in his chest, but also a deep sense of respect for the woman who had sacrificed so much for the people she loved. As the days passed, Jonah continued his work on the ranch, but everything felt different. Lee May was gone, and the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The silence between him and the land seemed deeper now, as though even the wind had grown quieter in her absence. Jonah knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. Life on the ranch went on, but Jonah was forever changed. He had been part of something greater than just his own loneliness. He had been part of Lee May's journey, and in some way that had helped him find a piece of peace he hadn't even known he was looking for. And though the rancher remained alone, he had come to understand something important. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to choose their own path.